speaker today, William Kilburn.
So I am William Keller, as Becky mentioned, and I come to you by way of an actual program within the U.S. Department of Justice, and that program is called the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. And I'll talk a little bit about the center because that's important for us while I'm here, but also to talk about my own personal story of resilience, but also of tragedy and resilience out of that. And then what we can do as communities, not just across Minnesota, but everywhere in the community, where we could make a difference and support someone who may be experiencing domestic violence, which I often call relationship violence, and what we've also heard as intimate partner violence in many ways. And so let me talk about the mission statement for the Office for Victims of Crime. And how many of you have ever heard of the Office for Victims of Crime? That's a good start. All right, so a few people have heard about the Office for Victims of Crime. But let me give you just a little bit of history of this right away, because it's very important and a personal reflection for me, because the Office for Victims of Crime was actually established in 1984. It's an interesting year, because not only was that office established, but the VOCA Act, the Victims of Crime Act, was also established in 1984. And that act did two major things that I can remember as an adult now doing the work. Two major things. One, it afforded rights victims. For the first time in our country, we had a list of rights that we could all rally around in terms of how do we advocate and support victims, and how do victims actually advocate for themselves. So it afforded victims' rights. Now, enforcement of those rights is a totally different thing. But starting with those rights was number one. Number two, it created the Crime Victim Compensation Fund, right? And who's heard of the Crime Victim Compensation Fund? Because this is a very, all right, so a few of you have heard of that fund. Well, that fund has everything to do with supporting victims who have been a victim of crime. And those funds are collected from individuals who have been convicted of crimes for fees, restitution, and fines. It's held on Capitol Hill in Congress. Billions of dollars has been collected. Now, it's sad to say that billions of dollars have been collected for restitution because we don't want crime in the first place. But when it does happen, those funds get to Capitol Hill, and on Capitol Hill, they release those funds out to the Office for Victims of Crime. So there's billions of dollars, probably $7, $8, $10 billion right now on Capitol Hill. But the Office for Victims of Crime takes some of those funds that they appropriated to be able to have programs such as the support that the U.S. Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, is giving today, which is why I'm here. So I'm a training and technical assistance provider. And we came by way of a grant to be able to speak here today. So I just want to give you a little history of that and why it's so important. I'll tell you why it's so important in a second, but its mission is for the enhancement of the nation's capacity to assist crime victims and to provide leadership in changing the attitudes, the policies, and the practices to promote justice and healing for victims across the United States. Okay? And not just across the United States, but obviously we have military serving overseas. Many of our victims of crime who have been traveling overseas, who have been victims of crime, being able to be supported with those funds, okay? So this is not about a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, or any of that kind of conversation, because victims have no borders. Trauma has no borders. So this isn't a political conversation, which I'm happy about. I love not having a political conversation because the work, I just love it, because the work that I do is not political nature. And that's why I love it so much, because I can talk with anybody, all right? And not have to get heated about who's going to win, all right? And then the Office for Victims of Crime established funds to be able to have the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center, which also supports and uses a variety of training and technical assistance opportunities like today, uses a variety of tools, surveys, and discussions and evaluations and feedback forms to be able to help develop the field a little bit more in terms of the training. And then thirdly, continue to monitor quality improvement across the field so that we don't have the same conversation going every time, that we improve that conversation, but we also improve our response to victims across the nation, okay? So with that being said, I always have to do this commercial for the Office of Victims of Crime, or I will not be doing commercials ever again. So, why was 1984 a powerful year for me? And why was 1984 important? Because on July 2nd, 1984, at age 10, I woke up to the screaming of my mom outside of our home. When that morning was over, I had experienced witnessing the murders of not only my mom, but my 12-year-old brother. And I remember distinctly, as a child, during the funeral, that my grandfather had a wad of cash. He had cash in his jacket. He always wore suits. He had cash he pulled out. And I just remember the adult conversations because I remember them paying cash to take care of the funeral, both my mother and brother. And that would be seared in my memory for many, many years, because that I would understand that it took the family to come together to be able to pay for a funeral, which we had to round up money and family to be able to do this. And I say that because in 1984, when the Victims of Crime Act was established, and it established the Crime Victim Fund, you know as well as I know, implementation of that act didn't happen for years. So we didn't get any crime victim money. And in fact, my grandmother went to the government back at that time, the local government at that time in DC, and asked for assistance for the kids now that they're grandkids, and they didn't have any resources for it. I told her, I'm sorry, we cannot help you because you aren't the parent. You know what I'm saying? The laws were very different back then. She did not have parental rights of us. So she could not receive public funds. Well, we've come a long way. We've come a long way. Every single one of these individuals in this silhouette could have crime victim compensation for their families if they apply for it. They have the right to apply for it, and they have the right to get it. But that wasn't around in 1984. And while we are now in 2024, many, many years later, we still have an opportunity to improve upon our systems and improve upon what we're doing in communities, in local governments, in federal government, to be able to respond to victims of crime with the kind of support that's very necessary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a bit of my story, and then I'm going to get into a bit of more discussion about what we can do as a community to be able to support and respond and move the needle. All right? So my story, again, as Becky mentioned earlier, can be emotionally provocative. Now, what does that mean? It means we're talking about trauma. It means we're talking about something very heavy. And for me, it's definitely a heavy subject. And I said, well, people are having lunch. I don't want to go down on it. And that's why I skipped a little bit of the details about what's going on, because we're at lunch, we're having a good time. But we're also talking about a very serious topic. And so I just want to make sure that we all have the space and create the space to be able to, as Becky mentioned, if something provokes us in a very emotional way, that we have the option to step out if we want to and think about our own self-care, do what we need to do to take care of ourselves, and also collective care. Let's not forget about collective care to be able to take care of each other. And I will say this right away, that if somebody gets up and seemingly has a reaction to what is being talked about today, I want you to think, maybe they're not having a reaction to what you just said. maybe they had a little bit of too much of that tea and lemonade. They gotta go to the bathroom. Okay? So we can get rid of the judgment, all right? Now before I get my story going, I'm gonna do something a little bit more interactive because I'm not the kind of speaker like I just want to talk at you like this, right? I want to get you a little bit involved. I know you're eating, so this exercise that I want to do is called the conditioning exercise, all right? And I want to get us up on our feet, but for those who really need to sit, go ahead. But just take a couple of seconds. This exercise only takes 1minute and 30 seconds, so I'm just going to ask for you to indulge me for a second, and everybody rise to your feet for just a moment. That salad's there, that meal just came out. So I'm going to ask our servers, please don't take any meals away from anybody while they're not looking. Okay? All right. So, and you can participate too. Everybody can participate. So this is going to be fun. All right. So we're going to do a conditioning exercise. All right. So I'm going to give you a word, and I want you to say that word out loud 10 times with me in your outside voice. Now I know some of you all have gone through elementary school, and you are louder than you are right now as an adult. But I want you to go back and grab that child, inner child in you, and this is your chance to be a child again, to yell without getting reprimanded. All right. So I'm going to give you a word. We're going to say that word out loud 10 times, and when we're finished, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind out loud. No worries, no judgment, okay? All right, again, one word, 10 times out loud in the outside voice. When we're finished, I'll ask you a question, and I want you to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. And the first word is spot, like on a leopard. Spot, okay? Just spot like on a leopard. I want you to say it one time out loud in your outside voice. Spot. Spot. That's a little inside, outside. You ready? Threshold. One more time. Spot. Spot. Okay. Somebody's getting in trouble with that. All right. Okay. 10 times. You ready? Let's go. Spot. 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 Come on. Spot. 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 What do you do when you come to a green light? What do you do when you come green light? No. What do you do when you come green light? No. Some people are stopping though. What do you do when you come to green light? No. But that's a resounding, so I know. So police officers, well, we should have monitored the parking lot. Because who drove? Who said stop? All right. I know there's not enough officers to take us all down. All right, so somebody will be stopped at that green light and get away with it. Number 2. White, all right? 10 times, white out loud. You ready? Let's go. White, 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 white. What do cows drink? What do cows drink? What do cows drink? For those who heard something else, please let people know. What do cows drink? And the calves drink? That's fine, all right. Last one, roast, like pot roast. I don't know if that's roast on the table, but roast. You ready? 10 times. Let's go. Roast, 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 come on. Roast, 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 roast. Where do you put the toaster? Where do you put the toaster? Where do you put the toaster? All right, have a seat, everybody. Let's get back to lunch. Yeah. A little exciting there. Okay, what happened? What happened? Still with me? All right. Okay, I know. Stopping at green light, feeding cows to themselves, and roasting toast. All right. The reason why I did that is a conditioning exercise. Grab it and do it with your friends and teenagers. It's most fun because you know as teenagers we do everything. So I want you to do that conditioning exercise beyond you. If you ever need to know how to do it, let me know. However, the reason why I do that conditioning exercise, the one big thing, is because when we were born, we learned everything that we're doing right now. When we were born, we learned how to walk, we learned how to talk, we learned how to act, and we learned how to eat food like this. We learned it somewhere. It didn't just happen. So we were conditioned that this is the way we were supposed to behave. What does that look like in an abusive relationship. I heard once a speaker the other day say that she was married to a person, and after their relationship had gone on for years and years and years, and the abuse happened, she finally found out why her husband was abusing her in the relationship. At least they were thinking that they found the reason. Well, the husband said that, well, that's the way I grew up. And so my mom took it, why couldn't you? So we learned this behavior. Things that we have to unlearn because it can be very harmful. But what if we see this behavior, what if we experience this behavior, but we have no clue? So that conditioning exercise really is an example of 1 minute and 25 seconds, a conditioning exercise, and I ask you a specific question: what do you do when you come to a green light? And some of you say, stop. Hearing the question. If we are not aware that we're in an abusive cycle, if we're not aware that our friends or our loved ones are in abusive cycles, then how are we supposed to intervene? What do we do to intervene and be able to interrupt the cycle when we have no clue that we're in? So that's why these discussions and these opportunities are very important for us today. Because I'm a therapist, right? And I say we can name it, we can tame it. Now, I'll give you some therapeutic hints because I do couples therapy. I'm not licensed here in Minnesota, so I can talk a little bit more out loud here. But a couple of things that are very helpful in terms of healthy relationships and how we can support each other in those ways. So I'll give you a couple of tidbits that I think are really, really cool and after I kind of move forward. But I do want to start with my story and just give a brief synopsis of my story. And I did an interview many years ago on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And I talked about my story and what had happened. So what I want to do is play you that video. And Jerron, if you can help me out. I'm going to play that video. And after that video, I'll talk a little bit more. And I'll zero in and I'll hone in on the community aspect of this because I think that was very important for me as a child. And I'll also ask Becky, you, Jerron, give me some time headlines because that's how I'm going to know to weave it up. All right? Okay. All right, so we've got a video going and Jerron's going to start that up and I'll be back.
And recently took our cameras back to the place where he says his childhood literally came to an end.
We're going to a home where really was a focal point of my growing up with my mother, the last days of her being alive. It's been a while since I've even driven past, and I don't think I've ever gotten out of the car. Oh God! Just remember coming out of this house and just running up the street.
The last time William stood on this street, he was just 10 years old. It was July 2nd, 1984, when he woke up to the terrifying sound of his mother screaming.
That was right there, right in front of the house, right in front of the driveway. Her boyfriend was dragging her. That's when he came in and he just started immediately loading his gun, and then he went over to my mother. And then he put the gun up to her face and he just shot her about 2 times in her face. And she dropped right on the floor immediately. And I just remember all of this blood coming out of her mouth and just going all over the floor. And then he went to my brother and then he shot my brother. Then he came to me and he put the gun to my head. He squatted down. He did the squat like this and he put the gun to my head. I immediately said to him, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. I'll do anything, I'll do anything. And I asked him, and he didn't say one word to me. And that's when I looked up into the sky. I was like, God, please don't let him kill me, please don't let him kill me. And for some reason, he just pulled back, and then he said to me, "You can leave." Just ran right down here on the right, and just was banging on the door. When they asked me, "Well, what's going on? What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I could only say my mother. And they kind of just, settled me down, They settled me down. I was just, I don't know what was going on, Just really lost.
All right, William. Thank you for taking us back there. But what happened to you? Obviously, you're here. William's here.
Wow, I lost everything. I mean, I lost my mom. I was a mama's boy, so I went everywhere with her. And, that day I actually wanted to go with her, but, when he came to me pleading for my life, I decided that I wanted to go the other way, just at 10. I was lost growing up as a teenager, and I didn't know where I was. I was just in a life of despair. I just had my own feelings just bundled up and get a chance to actually talk about it.
So who helped
My
you?
grandmother, I mean, she jumped right in that day. And she's been going ever since. She worked, I think, a week after.
Thank God for the grandmother.
Yeah, thank God for the grandmothers. But it's not just grandmothers. Families. Caretakers, caregivers. Foster care parents. I'll tell you, when I walked away from that house that day, I had my little shorts on, probably a little t-shirt, no shoes. I couldn't take my Matchbox cars and Hot Wheels cars with me. I couldn't take anything. When he said to me, "You could leave," the last thing on my mind was anything that I could grab, because I never knew I'd come back. It was, how do I get out of here safely and be able to get help for my mother and brother who were struggling. And I slowly got up off of the staircase. And I opened that door and I got out of the door and I slowly walked away. And when I got past that driveway, that's when I just ran. And all I could say was, "Call the police, call the police." That's all I could say. For 3 hours, there was this, I wouldn't say it was, they called it a barricade situation in the public. And tear gas exploding in our home. They kept firing it off in there. You could hear the noise from around the corner. And after 3 hours, police decided to enter. I know today that's very much changed in law enforcement, that necessarily not necessarily waiting that long to go in. I know now there are things that we can do to go in much faster to be able to do that, because the longer we wait, the longer there is the risk of casualties. But back then, 1984, 3-hour wait, trying to get in there. We had no phone, so there was nobody to talk to. And what I didn't realize, except for 10 years later, was that my mom's ex-boyfriend died by suicide the moment I left. And I didn't know that. So what I told police officers was something different, that he was alive, because that was the last thing I saw. But I'll tell you something about law enforcement that day. It's a special day today, because I did not know I was going to be training at the Law Enforcement Training Academy today. Training with future law enforcement officers today, going upstream in classrooms to talk about what might be happening. And when you arrive on a scene, when there are adults happening, we often miss and overlook who? The kids, children. But I wasn't overlooked this day. And I'll tell you, I was held inside of a home of a neighbor that I didn't really know well, but I remember officers that day did something very special. And that was what I call a trauma-responsive approach, even though we weren't using that language back in the 80s. Trauma-responsive approach. An officer or detective, whoever that person was, got me into a room, and I was so in shock. I remember it. I know I was so in shock. This was unbelievable for me. And it took my voice away, physically. It took me a while to kind of get the strength and the courage to actually talk again. That incident shut me up, and it shut me down. But an officer gave me a piece of paper and crayons. And that officer allowed me to draw what I had seen. That officer didn't know that I was a drawer. That officer didn't know that he was drawing on my strengths in a moment of crises, helping me to get to a place where I could have voice and I could make a choice to be able to support my loved ones who were struggling, who I thought were hopefully going to come through this. And unfortunately, that day ended without them continuing on, much like this flame is gone today, much like these individuals who experienced this in 2023. But life had to go on. I went to the 5th grade, and the strategy from our family was just to forget about it. But you know, when I was in that home that day where all these things were happening, the neighbors were outside, the community was outside, and when my grandmother moved us from that community, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have all these social media, so our relationships ended. I didn't have my best friend Pumpkin anymore. I was age 10 years old, so I couldn't drive myself around the old neighborhood to go back and see anybody. My grandmother never wanted to step foot in that neighborhood again in her life, so she moved to a different state. But what did it do? It completely disconnected us from our support system in our community. And I never got to see community members again. 10 years later after the killings, this is what I did. I went to the library because nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to hear what happened to me. So I went to the library in my city and I went back and I said, I want to know what happened 10 years ago because nobody's telling me anything. I want to know what happened to the community. I want to know what happened. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to find out what happened. And I went to the library and I went to go get the paper back 10 years ago, and they told me I had to go get on the microfiche film machine. And I did. And I wound that microfiche thing back. Here it goes, 85, 84, and I got to that point and I looked up 2 articles. The day my mother was killed, the next day an article came out, and then the next day another article came out. Well, the first article was about the killings and it was about the murder. But one of the things they said in that article, in the Washington Post, a renowned global newspaper, do you know what they said about my experience? They said a little boy named William witnessed the shootings, but was unhurt. Unhurt. Is that what you told my neighborhood? Is that the message that was sent to the community about my experience? They couldn't be farther than the truth. Maybe they should have said physically hurt. But as a victim of that crime, as a victim that day, it was a blanket statement that invalidated my experience, and I was very hurt and re-triggered or re-traumatized many years later because I felt like, well, if you're going to give that message out from the media, then nobody knew. Everybody thought that I'd just gone on and moved on in my life. What I also found out 10 years later is that I went to the CBS film crew, to the stations, the television station, and got the video equipment, VHS. I forgot what that was for a second. I got the VHS recording, and I sat down in front of it because I was like, what is going to be said? And you know, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you know, the cooking thing on the recording. And they were interviewing one of my neighbors, and the neighbor said it was so frantic, you could hear her voice. And she's like, oh my gosh, a little boy named William, he ran out, and then we all heard another shot. And it came over me. Oh my God. You mean he killed himself when I left? I told the officers that he was alive? So 10 years after that happened, I blamed myself again. Because I opened the door that morning because it was locked and my mom and her ex-boyfriend was outside of the home. I opened, because I was the only one home that morning. I opened the door and I never told the officers that I opened the door because I felt like I could be blamed for getting my mother killed. So I harbored that message, the for at least 5 to 7 years, but I finally came out with it in therapy that I was feeling this guilt. That I had something to do with the murders of my own mom and brother. Kids often see the truth directly, okay? They don't, debate like what adults do. They're like, you're not my friend no more. And they mean it for 3 minutes. And then they're your friend in the next 3 minutes. So guilt or no guilt, I convicted myself of those killings for years. And then 10 years later, I convicted myself again because I felt like I gave information to officers that wasn't correct. But it wasn't my fault. And I didn't have a lot of people around me who I trusted to tell me it wasn't your fault, kid. You weren't the one to do that. And I give you this story because I think it's important to think about what the community gets out of all of this. What are the messages that are told from the individuals who have experienced this loss of their lives? What is the messaging? It's not just about they weren't hurt physically or they weren't hurt. There's a lot that happens beyond these individuals. Families, colleagues. I heard officers up here who were responding to domestic violence or intimate partner violence calls, who are experiencing the loss of a colleague. It impacts the community. So one of the things that we can do is be able to reach out. I now get my community involved in organizations like this and get out and speak and get out and talk about it. But having those conversations about what violence is very important, because if we can name it, we can tame it, okay? And I'll just close out with this. I learned something that I think is very important in just personal relationships, number one. Richard Barrett said that our values and beliefs drive our decision-making, our actions and behavior. What we say, what we do, how we behave can be directly related and linked to what we value and believe, which makes up our belief system. But what if what we valued and believed was either lost, stolen, withheld from us, or even destroyed? That's what happened to me on that day in 1984. But we've come a long way. I have to pinch myself sometimes as I'm standing up here talking about this, because it took me 20 years plus to be able to talk about this. Oprah found me in an interesting kind of way, but that was 25 years after the murders, and my grandmother never talked about it, and the only time she heard about the killings and even heard the story, because she never wanted to hear it, her daughter was dead, her only daughter was dead, she doesn't need to hear the story, was on Oprah. And she was interested, she sat there and listened to it. And then she's not a big hugger, and Oprah gave her a hug, but I just kind of prayed, like, I hope she hugs Oprah back. And so what I want to end you with is from our own personal relationships. I believe, I studied the ecological model framework, which, focuses on, us as individuals, families, communities, and our society overall, those different sort of levels, those spaces, right? And on the individual level, I think it's very important. On the familial level, I think it's very important to understand our relationships in the way that we can drive healthy relationships. And I'll just say, look up the Gottman Institute's four horsemen of the apocalypse. There are four behaviors that have been studied that can lead to relationship failure if they are not addressed. Number one, this is my name. Number one, criticism. Criticism. You can't do anything right. Why can't you do this? It's all this criticism which can lead to a person feeling invalidated and responses coming back that are defensive, because that's the number 2 one, defensiveness. And number 3 is contempt. Who knows another word for contempt? Disgust. I'm like disgusted with you now. Like, I've criticized enough, I've been criticized, I can't be in this relationship anymore, I'm done with it, and so I get disgusted and I have contempt for the relationship. So all of those 3 things can lead to stonewalling, shutting down, stonewalling. Those 4 behaviors, 90% prediction, can lead to the failure of a relationship. But if you don't know, then you don't know. If you're still stopping at a green light when there's criticism happening, you're still going to probably be a part of that criticism, okay? So we can end those things by being aware of them and not stopping at those green lights, not feeding cows their own milk, or expecting them to actually feed themselves by their own milk. I'm just one of the answers that was given earlier. Okay? All right, and plug up your toasters, please, before you have toast. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Will. That was fantastic. And I need to be a better listener, is what I learned from us, and pay attention. But like Will said, it's important to educate ourselves and to make those around us aware. So we are always extremely grateful to work side by side with Someplace Safe. And we encourage you to please stop outside the table today, pick up some extremely valuable resources, not only for yourself, but for those around you. We'd also like to thank some of our sponsors today. Alamere, the Douglas County Sheriff's Federation, the Community Woodfire Pizza Organization that we got to be a part of this year, and the REA Roundup, or Operation Roundup. We'd also like to give a huge thank you to Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center for hosting us today. And additionally, we'd like to give a special thanks to Winning Edge Graphics for your creative and financial assistance with the 12 new silhouettes that we needed this year.